America's always been very driven by subcultures. We do have that sort of unchosen living next to people who might not agree with you and might not have all the same interests of you. That provides that sort of great diversity. Well, if your subculture is all chosen along common interests and ideology, then that's really a poverty.
Tim Carney is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, the senior columnist for the Washington Examiner, and the author of numerous books, including his latest, Family Unfriendly: How Our Culture Made Raising Kids Much Harder Than It Needs to Be. Listen in as we discuss the problems facing American families today and the current political, cultural, and economic structures at the root of those problems.
Benedictine College is transforming culture in America, one conversation at a time. From our studios in Atchison, Kansas, these are the Benedictine Dialogues.
Right. Well, Mr. Carney, welcome to the Benedictine Dialogues.
Thanks for having me.
Great to have you here. Great to have you on campus. And I've been really looking forward to this conversation. I think we've got a lot of mutual interests and some concerns as well. And I know you've been writing for quite some time on this issue of a breakdown of community, a loneliness epidemic, many people are calling it. And of course, here at Benedictine College, one of our main principles is to build a community of faith and scholarship, with community being a very specific term. And so I guess to start off the conversation, it's how bad is it right now?
Yeah, so the Surgeon General of the United States declared a loneliness epidemic. And some people rolled their eyes, why is this a Surgeon General's job? But I thought it was very important to at least diagnose that problem. And we see it across all sorts of things. Marriage rates are dropping. The percentage of people living alone is at record highs. Birth rates are at record lows. I mean, they've been falling, and not just since COVID, and we'll talk about COVID later, I'm sure, but since 2008, the Great Recession, the marriage and birth rates started dropping, and then they never rebounded despite the economic bounce back. Robert Putnam diagnosed in 2000 in Bowling alone that people just belong to fewer things. Well, in the last 23 years, it's just gotten worse from there in general. And the darkest symptom of this really is what's been called the deaths of despair, a rise in suicides, increase in alcohol deaths and drug-related deaths. And that is enough to explain why, even before COVID, lifespans in the U.S. were shortening. So how bad is it? I think that's pretty bad.
Yeah, if it's causing the deaths of people, we're not talking about just a mental health issue. It's certainly that,
Yes.
But it's leading towards something that it's our nature to have community. So it's something that's lacking on almost a metaphysical level.
Yeah, I mean, Aristotle said man is a political animal, a really sort of social animal. Man needs to be in community. And so you're pulling us out of our habitat if you're saying, oh, well, you're going to, go through your life alone. As long as you have money or food or whatever, you're fine. No, pulling people out of social environments, and not just having some friends or seeing other people, but sort of having people rely on you, having people expect you, having things that you belong to, an institution that you call us. That's always how I think of it. Like if I think of my children's school, my parish, my employers, I always say, oh, well, we're growing. We don't open until after Labor Day. If you have lots of things that you call us, and you know that they think of you as being like a family, those aren't just nice things. And those of us who have them sometimes, it's great. But as you're saying, it's absolutely necessary to human thriving.
It seems like it's pretty obvious that we're going through a major difficulty as a nation, and it seems like this is actually just the modern West in general. I'm sure Europe is, I don't know if it's further along the way than the U.S. is, or if it's not, but what are some of the kind of outlying symptoms of the breakdown of community? What are some of the things that this is causing for us?
So again, the deaths of despair is a big part, retreat from marriage, collapse in the birth rates, but I also think a lot of people don't realize it's changing our mindset. It's making people think that this is normal. So there's a book called A Quest for Community by Robert Nisbet decades ago, and he used the word alienation, and he said it's being separated from society, but also not seeing the purpose in society. So that's one of the kind of most tragic symptoms of this isolation and alienation, is people thinking that's the way life is supposed to be, or by nature is for humans, is ultimately isolated. Where your interactions with other people are all just transactions. Oh, I give you money, you give me goods. I give you services, you give me money. Even to the point of dating relationships through the apps, often it's just considered to be, well, as long as it's consensual as a transaction, then we're done and we're going separate ways. And so I've had people who have written to me. When I write about this, somebody on Twitter will respond when I'm talking about doing stuff in community. They say, well, that doesn't really exist. One guy used the term, life is a single player game, like a video game reference. And I just thought about that. And this was some random guy on Twitter, but it just captured so much of what I see. And you see op-eds in the New York Times about how, well, marriage is kind of prison and you can get most of the stuff you want out of marriage if you just kind of sign a contract with another person. So that's one of the, you see how it becomes self-reinforcing. Yes. Alienation leads to a lack of a belief in community and belonging, which then is going to lead to more alienation.
Yeah, and I believe Nisbet was also, he pointed to the Athenians after the Peloponnesian War as far as they lost the nerve of being, understanding human beings as something that can accomplish great things, that we should seek transcendental goals and fulfill our life through beauty, goodness, and truth. And instead, it's kind of like we're all kind of beaten down, and our head's been forced to just deal with everyday life in the slug of going through the rat race, if you will.
Yeah, and I like the sort of image you gave there of like sort of looking down at your feet, because that's not looking around at society. It is looking at the day-to-day. And it's interesting in Christian theology how ultimately our relationship with God is going to be a one-on-one thing. Salvation it's never like a group of people get saved. It's always individual. That's very clear in theology. We Catholics don't always like using the phrase of a personal relationship with Christ, but it's definitely part of our theology. So why is it that God made us so that other people are needed to draw our eyes to God? But that's clearly what happens. Yes. And that's why Christ had to come in person of a human, and where he said, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am. God knows he made us so that we need other people to see him. So that's, to me, I don't have my mind wrapped around it. That's about as profound as I can get on it. Saying, that's kind of weird, but it's definitely true.
Yes, which could also, and I'd be interested in your take on this, is that possibly even adding to this rise of atheism that we have right now? It's been going on for some time, but the numbers post-COVID especially post-shutdown of many churches, it's kind of skyrocketing. Right
and what I say in Alienated America and almost everything is that the causal arrows point in both directions. Collapse of community leads to collapse in religious belief, and collapse in religious belief leads to collapse in community. And that really is, the COVID example drives that home, where people stopped going to church and they still had, their Bibles at home, their ability to pray, for about 3 months in Maryland, we're watching our local pastor on YouTube in our living room and sort of trying to do family mass that way while dogs are walking among us wondering why the heck we're kneeling on the living room floor. But if it wasn't for our friends or constant contact, that provided an uplift. People who don't have that, if their connection to the mass, to church, whatever, in any denomination is a little weaker, they're more likely to fall away once they're not getting revitalized by other people. And so you saw across denominations, across religions, the data show that a lot of people just didn't go back. People who were going every week to synagogue, Jumu'ah, mass, church, then afterwards, a significant number of them stopped going. And one of the points I make, and I try to make this point to other journalists who are not religious, who might be more to the left of me, I say, if you care about people's well-being, you care about them belonging to stuff and having community. For most of America, the main source of community is their religious congregation. And so when people are losing that, then a lot of them don't have anything, or at least nothing sort of thick and meaningful.
And I love that you bring up Nisbet in particular, because I actually just reread that book. And one thing that he talks about as well is that we've gotten rid of so many intermediary institutions, the softball clubs and the Lions clubs, and all of those attendance is starting to drop majorly. So to your point, one of the last remaining standing institutions was the church. It's your local community where you can go and see your neighbors and worship together. And if that goes, what's left? And Nisbet's concern was the state.
And which is exactly what Tocqueville said, right?
Yeah.
He said there's nothing more remarkable about Americans than the fact that they're constantly uniting and forming organizations ranging from the grand and sublime down to the quotidian and everyday, big to small, local, national, etc. But he also said that he uses the words age of equality or love of democracy, that those ideas would create what I think you can, in today's terminology, you would call sort of a hyper-individualism, and thus people wouldn't like belonging to things because belonging to things isn't just transactional, right? It's relational. Somebody else has a claim on you if you belong to something. And so people turn to the state, in part because they don't want to think that they owe their neighbor or anything help, but they also don't want other people to help them because then they'll feel in some sort of a debt. Sure. And so a sort of arm's length transaction with the state really does sort of rise up in that place. And so that was certainly Tocqueville's argument that people turning away from the locals, particularly religious institutions, would turn them towards the state.
It seems to me like there's just this kind of almost a perfect congruing of all of these kind of various aspects that come together, and we'll talk about COVID in a minute of how that kind of like exploded some things. But you also have, these philosophies or anthropologies of a lack of rootedness or the power of will, going into the hyper-individualism, things like that, and again, going back to Nisbet, because that's just in my mind now, he was concerned about that in the 50s, even at kind of like the ivory tower philosophers were thinking of these things of rootedlessness and things like that. But he didn't necessarily see the concrete evidence of where that was going, and now we see it, right? And so, how much of the academy maybe was influencing some of this kind of Gnostic understanding of community and ourselves?
Certainly, there's. I think it's always been present in philosophy, going back to the Socrates' peers, as the real happiness, a real understanding that life was a single-player game. Again, none of the ancient Athenians would have put it that way, but that was sort of an argument, and you see it in the Stoics a bit. I don't want to pretend to know more about the Stoics than I do, but again, that idea that the pursuit of virtue, because ultimately you're the only person who can really make yourself virtuous, and you extrapolate from that and ignore the fact that really, even if we're just talking about individual virtue, you need a training ground, you need practice, you need friends. And so I think it goes back a very long way. And Rousseau was obviously a guy who sort of argued that you're not really yourself as long as you're influenced by norms and customs and all that. And the funny thing is, I think that is the age at which that appeals to people most is probably about 18, right? When you're, I mean, that was me as a freshman showing up and reading about Achilles at St. John's and being like, he's right, Agamemnon's wrong. It's that simple, right? That the individual pursuit of virtue and that was everything, and it's ultimately selfish. It doesn't acknowledge our reliance on other people. But yeah, you're right that modern philosophies also have this sort of atomistic view. I have one friend who's he's a liberal journalist, and he laments that his friends sometimes see it that way. And he says that they see the human individual as a disembodied, autonomous bundle of rights just floating around like a billiard ball, and that idea, I think, does seep into academia. And if your school isn't dedicated to saying, actually, what you need to do is find a role to play in institutions and belong to things, and that's how you make the world better, make yourself better. That idea that we should be role players, that's sort of, that sounds demeaning, right? Because I was a role player in a baseball team once, where it's like, you're gonna pinch run and you're gonna play late inning outfield defense, right? If you're saying that that's what all you're gonna do in your life is play roles, people think, oh, well, no, I wanna be more, I wanna be great, I wanna be a leader. Fine, but you're going to join institutions and play roles. So just that idea of serving others, I think that cuts contrary to a lot of the contemporary sort of zeitgeist, I guess.
Yes. And I think that's what particularly John Paul II was seeing with his concern for the human being and the anthropology that was being proposed all the way back before he became Pope, and the Christian humanism that kind of came out of him, and of course the humanist movement as well during that time, seeing that. So now I want to ask, what did COVID do? I think everybody knows, looking back, lots of mistakes were made, but now we've got to deal with the ramifications of what was done.
So it made us believe that other people were, at least vectors for disease. I wrote a piece I ran in the New York Times about how we needed more aggressive school opening, and multiple comments said, I don't want all those vectors running around my classroom. It's like, that's, there are days that you see your kids and the snot on their face, and you think, okay, they are vectors of disease. But that people in essence were vectors, if not kind of pathogens themselves. And so that idea, I think, really is a misanthropic idea that got driven home. And I even saw writers say, oh, well, one of the things I like about masks, it makes it easier to, it keeps my chatty neighbors at bay. Oof. They're less likely to come up and talk to me if I'm wearing a mask. And so there were a lot of misanthropic elements that came out and were fostered during that. It drove people away from church, and church attendance definitely went down. It drove people away from community. It shuttered main streets. So in all those kind of direct ways, I think you can definitely see the harms, and some of the second order effects that I often focus on. I think a big part of the crime wave that a lot of this country is seeing is from that. Yeah. In 2021, the crimes that went up were like assault, murder, carjackings were often the carjacker would then just crash the car. So these crimes weren't crimes of need. It wasn't somebody breaking into a house and stealing money so they could, pay rent. It wasn't somebody taking a car and selling it for parts. They were antisocial crimes. I don't mean to imply that some crimes are productive and some are non-productive, but these were the really non-productive crimes.
There's an end to some of these others. Yeah.
And it was just acting out an antisocial impulse. And I think that was definitely fostered. And where I live in the DC area, the carjacking rises entirely among high school age or middle school age kids. Wow. So again, kids who were kept out of school, whose basketball leagues were canceled, who were driven off of the soccer field in those early months, that they lost their sociability and became antisocial, would commit crimes against their neighbors for no reason.
What's your take on the argument that a lot of what we've seen post-COVID was already kind of at the boiling point, and COVID gave everybody an excuse? So, especially the atheism thing,
Yeah, so the falling away from church, if you didn't come back, and so I was a Sunday school teacher when we lived in Maryland, and certainly the families that stuck around through COVID were very devout families who took religious education seriously. I noted that I repeatedly got corrected by my second grade, First Communion students. I would make an offhand comment. I'd be like, oh, Mr. Carney, there were no 10 commandments by the time the flood came. I was like, you know what I mean, okay? So they were just these top tier students, and it became easier for us to teach. But then you realize the sadness of it is we had 9 kids instead of 25. And those 16 families we lost, part of what you're doing in a church, part of what you're evangelizing to are the parents of the kids who show up so they can get the pictures in the white dress. And when we lose those, that's a lot. So yes, they were not firmly attached to the church, but I think it's really uncharitable to say, oh, well, they weren't really Christians. And so that's shown by the fact that they got driven away. I think all of us always require somebody pulling us back in, whether it's to our faith or our job or our family or just sort of having our life together. But I do think about how we were so ready to adopt the social distancing, all that stuff in March of 2020 when they said, stay away from everybody, do this. That, to me, suggests that there was already in our minds this idea of humans and biology are bad and distance and chemistry are safe.
Interesting. And then to kind of add to, again, the kind of like all these converging things that are going up to we are where we are now, a big one I would imagine that you've looked into is social media and what that's done to us. The promise was that we'd be more connected than ever, but it seems like the stats are going a different direction.
Yeah, so it's interesting. When Alienated America came out, I first said, online community is better than no community, but it's not as good as in-person community. I'm not so sure about the first part of that anymore. I do think it really does displace real in-person community. If we think we're getting our community from our Snapchats, our group texts, our Facebook and Twitter and et cetera. And it just, when you look at teenagers now, they're less likely to hang out with their friends. And some of them maybe are, playing the video games with the headphones on, and so they're hanging out with their friends remotely, which again is better than nothing, I would say. But it might be that the video games make them feel like they don't have to hang out with their friends in person. And so, yeah, I do think that technology, I think there's a deeper aspect to it too. Social media, if you think about, again, Instagram, Snapchat, a TikTok, you're scrolling through for hours. You're seeing all these people. Often it's a solo performance. And so you are connecting with these people who you're not connected with. But you're also starting to see yourself that way. You're like, okay, imagine there's a camera following me. And so you turn inwards and you think about your life not in relation to other people, but in relation to the whole of internet and social media. So I do think it corrupts, it changes how we see ourselves in a real negative way.
It also creates masks as well. We put a certain portrait of who we are out there. And amongst the real community of people being in the same place at the same time, you can't put those masks up. People will see that inauthenticity very quickly, I think.
Yeah. Obviously, people have been putting on masks, a public face, et cetera. Sure. But it's a lot easier to maintain a very well-crafted fiction online. One of my favorite details I realized, there's this woman who's getting her PhD in momfluencers, so influencers in the momosphere, which I care about a lot in family. And she made a point, there are no neighbors in the momosphere. So these moms who have like the perfectly dressed kids who like all the same hue of different colors, and they're in the house and everything looks like it took no effort and all of that. There's never like a neighbor kid in the yard. Like if they're all like running through the sprinklers, it's only your own kids. If they're playing wiffle ball, if you're sitting on the bench, every moment is a family portrait. And like nobody, so it gives this impression, oh, I'm raising my kids without the help of neighbors.
Yes.
And that is a massive fiction that's possible. And that plants that head in the minds of, the 22, 24, 26-year-old, either newlywed or wants to be a mom. It's like, that looks too hard. Yeah. I can't pull off what that woman's pulling off. And I want to be like, she's not pulling it off either.
Exactly. It's a photo op. Yeah. It also, I think, what the internet in general has created is an opportunity for community amongst all of these subcultures. We don't really have this mainstream culture anymore. If you think about the 50s or Fulton Sheen being one of the main figures that most people would have known the name and would have seen him on TV. We don't have that anymore. That's broken down in a big way, especially if you think about film and the things that create culture. Instead, we've got all these kind of like subcultures, and people can say, I'm part of that community, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the community's in their backyard.
Well, and so that's the thing. America's always been very driven by subcultures because we're massive, because we're diverse, because we have immigrants, because we have religious pluralism. But the subculture used to mean like, I live in Fishtown area of Philadelphia. Yeah. Right. It was not a chosen subculture. Yeah. And so the diversity of viewpoints, and in some cases you had, back then you had more socioeconomic diversity in a local place. In the 1960s compared to today, rich people, poor people, middle class people were more likely to live in the same neighborhood. we don't have a great history of these, local subcultures having racial diversity. That's one of the huge sort of crimes of American history. But you do have that sort of unchosen living next to people who might not agree with you and might not have all the same interests of you. That provides that sort of great diversity. Well, if your subculture is all chosen along common interests and ideology, then that's really a poverty. So this is again, it cuts against some modern thinking. If it's the things we don't choose that enrich us. Well, we think, technology allows us to choose to spend our time only on the things and with the people that we choose. And I think you agree, we end up poor because of that.
Yes, it reminds me of Chesterton's whole understanding of the family as a kind of formation of citizens, because you have to deal with people that you don't agree with. You still have to love them, regardless of how much you might fight, all that kind of stuff. And so when you get sent out as a citizen, whatever ideological side you're on, I can still get along with you.
And this, by the way, is the next book I'm working on is on family and the collapse in the birth rates and how we sort of have an anti-family culture. But one of the aspects is that kind of unchosen, that we don't accept the unchosen. It's my life, my choice, and so everything's going to be consensual. I was describing in that book the moment when our oldest daughter was born. And I mean, we were totally ready for it. Like, we had the nursery, had little white letters with her name up on the wall. We had chosen the name the second we found out she was a girl. We had sung to her in utero. And then she comes, who are you? I have never seen you in my whole life. And now you're my roommate for at least 18 years? Who does that? We chose to bring in a stranger to our house for 18 years is what parenting is. And so that's one of the reasons I think, again, neighbors are to some extent unchosen, right? Oh, well, I didn't even sign up to have this guy's my neighbor. He just happened to live. I didn't have any say over that. So that's why one of the declines in neighborliness, I think, is, again, the idea that nothing should be thrust on us unless we chose it. A very modern mindset is anti-community.
Yeah, and it's led to, another epidemic, if you will, that we have is a childlessness epidemic, and in large part because they're seen as burdens. They're seen as things that just cost a lot of money, and I maybe can't handle what it takes. One of your more recent articles that I read was talking about this spike in binge drinking, especially amongst, I think you said 35 to 50.
Yep.
I'd love to kind of have you extrapolate a little bit about your findings there, and what was it that's kind of maybe causing some of that? Yeah,
so there was this big study it's a regular study on alcohol use in the United States, and that was sort of the surprising thing, was how much binge drinking, having more than 5 drinks in a row, had just gone up. How much have you done this in the last 2 weeks? The number saying yes had absolutely skyrocketed, particularly among age 35 to 50, old millennials, young Gen X. And one of the possibilities, and we need to study this more, but that's precisely the people who are the 35 to 40-year-olds are the people who are much less likely to have children than was a generation ago. Especially you take in the delay in marriage until you're about 30, and then COVID hits, 3 years. The people who thought, I'll have kids in my early 30s, they didn't get married, or because of the combination of COVID and the cultural delay in marriage and family formation. And so it's definitely, there's a high statistical correlation between binge drinking and, or negative correlation between binge drinking and parenthood. Even marriage drives down a man's likeliness to binge drink, and women as well. People who have kids, and it goes beyond drinking and drug use to sort of other crime. And sometimes I think, well, it's maybe because you just don't have time to do all that, but also for a lot of these studies point out that a few months before the first baby is born, so upon realizing that you're having a kid, people's behavior sort of rights. They're less likely to do things that are harmful to others, but I think much less likely to do things that are harmful to themselves. Your ability to believe in your self-worth, if you don't have, even somebody who starts intellectually understanding the Christian understanding of the self, nothing makes it easier to think, actually, I have value than raising kids and being married, right? Like, there are people who literally won't eat if you're too hungover to make them breakfast. And that's that burden of being relied on, of having that work, is important. We need it.
Thank you for listening to the Benedictine Dialogues. We'll be right back to the show after this brief message.
A reckoning is coming. And this reckoning is so important for us to understand. There is so much at stake. If we don't win this battle for freedom in the U.S., socialism will prevail. And the key to success is virtue in business. Faced with the question, is capitalism the economic system of choice? Believe it or not, the popes asked that question, and they answered it. We have to reclaim that moral tether that's going to allow us to operate a well-functioning free market. I'm Dave Geenans. Welcome to the series, The Reckoning, where we explore the ultimate battle for freedom in the United States between socialism and virtue in business.
Be sure to visit media.benedictine.edu. And now, back to the show.
So it seems to me then that when we talk about this givenness, these things that we don't choose, there's an aspect of purpose and meaning that's given or at least formed in us of the communities we're raised in, the families, but especially whenever you're dealing with the next generation or your spouse. I mean, if you become selfish and try to live as a good husband and father, it's just simply not going to work. If you want to be a good husband and father, you have to become selfless in a lot of ways. And so you get purpose through that.
I always say the first selfless things I did were after getting married. I think the graces with the sacrament of marriage made it easier to do something and be happy to do something for another person. And then parenthood is that times 10. Yeah. So I've had friends who just on their own went out and like fed homeless people or just were always volunteering. And my nature is uglier. I never did that. But Jesus said, actually, you have to do these things. You have to feed the hungry and clothe the naked. Well, guess what? I wake up, there's hungry, naked people in my house. They're right there. I don't have to go find them. It's made easy for you when you have family. And I mean, it's sort of a joke, but I really believe that's one of the big virtues. A couple years ago, I was in a modern Orthodox Jewish neighborhood in Maryland, and a couple of the people I met, these Jewish dads, they pointed out that be fruitful and multiply was God's first commandment. And I said, do you have like a theological explanation or just like, is there just a practical reason that he needed more people or like, was there a reason why that's first? And one of the dads said, well, I think that that's the simplest way to push us towards virtue, towards maturity, towards thinking about being responsible, not harming ourselves, but not putting ourselves first. And I really do believe that parenthood is, and when St. Paul said, you know, I think ideally maybe everybody is celibate, but most people can't handle that. I think part of it was not just about sort of sexual temptation, but just about serving other people. It becomes much easier when you have kids. And then there's a lot of study, the people surrounded by kids, even non-parents, that they behave more virtuously when they're thinking about or seeing kids. Yes. And studies can say different things, but that's one that I do not have any trouble believing. Yeah.
And you mentioned the sort of birth dearth that happened after 2008 that hasn't risen back up. And we talk about that here at the college sometimes because how that's going to affect, especially in 2026 when we're going to start to see that affect student body numbers and the like. Where is the silver lining of all of that? Or is there one? I mean, it's pretty low.
So the positive thing is that people actually are seeing it. The New York Times, who I think on culture, on marriage, often is pushing in the wrong direction. They have like an anti-marriage, pro-divorce op-ed every other week. But they have noted repeatedly, to the consternation of many of their readers, that there is a baby bust in the US, in almost every wealthy country, and that it has bad effects. So they had stories that shows these villages in Japan where the government has to show up and there's 6 old ladies. And it's like, you ladies have to leave because we're cutting off the sewage and the electricity. And connecting that to the birth rates that have been falling for 15 years in the United States, that that's sort of the New York Times sticking its neck out, and they've done that repeatedly. Wow. So that's sort of the silver lining, is that the overpopulation scare from about the time that you and I were little is mostly gone. A lot of the public still believes that, which is why one of the reasons I'm writing a book about it, why I'm glad the New York Times writes about it. And you still have Paul Ehrlich, who wrote the 1968 book, The Population Bomb, which predicted mass global starvation within 5 years. The opposite happened. He still gets on 60 Minutes. But in general, I think the myth of overpopulation is being punctured because it's impossible to avoid the fact that a aging population, and then in a lot of places a shrinking population, is really harmful. And I always just start with the fact that the United States has fewer children, that's people under 17, than it did a decade ago. Not percentage of the population. There's actually fewer kids. Like if you take all our high school, the public schools that lose population, it's not just because they closed down during COVID, it's that there are fewer school-aged kids. And it's really hit at elementary schools years ago, middle schools. High schools are just starting to face it. And as you're mentioning, colleges who don't necessarily have the ability to rely on government to bail them out, they're very worried about this population bust. I say the baby bust in 2026 will turn 18, and you'll have fewer high school graduates every year from then on out. This also affects the labor force. So if there's a silver lining, it's that unemployment's going to be low for the foreseeable future. But that means that when you and I retire, maybe we have big 401ks. Doesn't do us any good if there's nobody we can hire to fix our plumbing.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting too how much this conversation's in the water right now, especially, I mean, it was only a year or two ago that Elon Musk was talking about this as a major concern economically. And I'm hopeful that the conversation goes beyond pure economics, that it's part of us as human beings. The fact that we're not having children shows what we think about human beings. I mean, and the hopelessness that we have.
That's right. And if you just limit it to the economics, so I came here from Southwest Iowa where I first started to notice these small towns that are getting smaller. And one guy says, well, if you want to know why nobody has kids, come look at my tractor. It has so much ability, and the genetically engineered seeds have so much more yield. Says when I was a kid, my dad needed me and my 8 brothers, and now I need my tractor. And so then you think, okay, were we only raising kids as a race because we needed them to shuck the corn? And I appreciate the free labor. Sometimes I'm so lazy. If I want a drink from the fridge, I'm like, wait, if my kids aren't home, I have to get it myself. But again, that's not the Christian view of children. And so maybe it was easier 2 generations ago to tell people to have kids. Now you actually have to somehow persuade them, no, actually, the kids you have are good. They are, and not good because you're good, because you're going to raise them well. No, they're good. I tell a story of, we had this preschool teacher who taught 5 of our children, and then she told us at the last minute that she wasn't going to be there the last day. So we didn't have time to get her a gift for the last day of school. We thought we owe her like the best last day school gift ever because she's preschool it's one of the reasons we moved to the parish we ended up in. And so on her last day, Katie was like, what are we going to do? And I said, we're going to bring her a gift. So we brought her all 5 kids, including the 12-year-old who was towering over her. And she just broke down in tears. So you make fun of people who think that they or their kids are God's gift to the world. But I was like, you know what? No, I brought my kids. And that was a gift.
That's awesome.
And if you show up at like a neighborhood cookout or something, and the organizers are worried, are enough people going to show up? And boom. You and I, we both have 6 kids. We show up, it's an instant quorum. Exactly. You've seen that look on somebody's face where they're like, yes, people are here.
We've got a full basketball game going already and a football team.
And so like that idea that if you have children and you bring them places, you're bringing a gift with you every time.
Yeah, and part of the interesting thing about this conversation as well is there's also a re-examination of our use of birth control for so long, especially, chemicals getting into our systems and all of that
and
kind
our
of
fish
stuff.
ending up sterile.
That there's actually a lot of truth behind what they called a conspiracy theory for a while. But then also the transactional use of another human being. I mean, even at levels of Hollywood, people are talking about this now, of like using another person for my own end is not a good thing. And so then when it comes to children, if your idea is use, like it's a pretty one-sided game for most of the child's life.
The input really exceeds the return for a very long time. Even after they're able to make you coffee or make you scrambled eggs. But I also think the contraceptive mindset affects us so much more than we think. It obviously affects our attitude towards sexuality and family, but I think that our readiness in 2020 to sort of be afraid of other people and to kind of hate biology was partly inculcated through the contraceptive mindset that, you know, every girl starting from 14 is getting put on the pill no matter what. That's the idea that the modern life and happiness is about overcoming biology. It's and that was actually a term I just encountered. Warren Hearn, a late-term abortionist from Colorado, he wrote a piece in 1971 titled "Biological Tyranny," and it was how the main thing we need to do is help people defeat the tyranny of their own biology. And so that idea, I really think has affected us in far broader ways that we're not going to understand. Maybe 100, 200 years from now, people will look back at, you know, the second half of the 20th century and the next 50 years and say, well, this was the contraceptive age. This was the age when people thought, well, biology's bad and chemistry is the solution. But on parenting, I think it's done another thing, which is made it seem like every child is a choice. And if you make a choice to get a child, well, then it's your problem. It's like if you've got a boat and it's constantly causing you headaches, like I might help you if you're like, Tim, I really need your help. Just come and, you know, bring your tools. But eventually I'm like, dude, you bought the boat. Maybe you shouldn't have bought the boat. And that's the way our society thinks about children. And so parents end up taking on so much more of the burden than they should because the broader community thinks, well, if you made the decision to have children, it's your duty to take care of them in all ways. Obviously, it's your primary duty. Obviously, you shouldn't just leave your children and say, okay, everybody else feed them. But the idea that it's just a lifestyle choice and it's not, and it doesn't deserve any special accommodation, I think that's the primary effect of contraception on the Western mind.
Yes. I can't tell you how many times I've been in a grocery store with all of my children and my wife, and we get stares from everyone because they're like, what in the world is this like tribe of people that's walking through the grocery store? And I'm like, I'm not even that big of a family compared to people I know. So, but there's this mindset, and it happens on airplanes where like a baby comes in and everybody's like, oh shoot. A dog comes in and they're like, oh, I want to pet it, you know? And it's because we think of these things as just straight burdens. Burdens to society. So when people see the big families, they're like, oh gosh, look at all the resources you're sucking out of whatever. And then, you know, the lack of seeing people, human persons, as gifts.
And this is not it's not narrowed to any political persuasion. I remember there was a Wall Street Journal op-ed objecting to the existence of a child tax credit, and it said, why don't we have a puppy tax credit? And I just thought, the tax code is for people. Because we write it. If the puppies got to write the tax code, maybe it would be different. But we write it. And so, I mean, a tax code without a child tax credit at all, if it doesn't have, because we scrapped the dependent exemption before they increased the child tax credit. So basically they're saying that a household of 6 should get taxed the same with a certain amount of income as a household of 2. Which is an insane amount of thing because the money is valuable per person. And so they're literally saying children don't count as humans, they count as consumption items. And again, I see that repeatedly from sort of conservative writers or free market writers who object to a tax code that acknowledges the humanity of babies.
So we've talked a lot about sort of the shadowy or dark side of all of this. Where are some of the areas you're seeing glimmers of hope and where we're going?
So the idea that what I argued in Alienated America in 2019 was what is causing a lot of the suffering, the retreat from the labor force, the retreat from marriage, the deaths of despair. It wasn't just economic, it was cultural, it was about a lack of belonging. And when I went around on my sort of book tour, which included a stop here, I met with a lot of groups that I had very little in common with ideologically. They'd be basically kind of left-wing social worker organizations. And they all said they were starting to see, one woman put it, programs don't help people. She helps, widows, single moms, orphans, etc. Programs don't help people. Relationships help people. And so she saw her job, if she could get a bunch of single moms to be friends and meet up every week, not with people who could hire them, not with people, who could provide material support or anything, just with one another, that helped them out. And so that perception that I saw, because I'm a writer, I'll talk to people who are suffering. I'm not that great at solutions. That's not my strong point. But the people who dedicate their lives to solutions, I saw again and again the growing number. And a lot of them had to do it on a hyper-local level, because you can't have a national department of local community cohesion. But to see on the local level so many people in a city like Charlotte, in a city like St. Louis, I've met these people who are working and saying, I work on these 4 blocks in St. Louis. And the main thing is to get the pastor to know everybody in the neighborhood, to get everybody in the neighborhood to know the pastor, to get somebody to give their house to just be a place to come and hang out and play board games or video games. And I've been exposed to that and how that's sort of blossoming and spreading, 10,000 different small solutions instead of one big solution. So that's my glimmer of hope, is getting exposed to people who are trying to help others by putting them just in community, helping them belong.
And for those who desire to help heal some of these fractures, to help heal the bonds of culture, it seems to me like the ones that are aware of that need to be really comfortable with being uncomfortable. Get out there, do things that you don't normally do, introduce yourself to people you don't normally introduce yourself to. Don't ask about politics right away. Just hang out, just be friends. It's a strange solution, but just be friends.
And again, so Pope Francis, when he first wrote about the poor, he wrote about the inclusion of the poor. And it struck me that I think a lot of people think that if they just donate, or if they just happily pay their taxes and support a bigger welfare state, that's taking care of their duty to the poor. And so the uncomfortable thing then is, are you willing to include them? Like, are you willing to set up a table where you sit down with them? One of the things I talked to a few pastors about was during COVID, these free food distribution really set up, where churches would start giving out food, and then they kept doing it because the food kept coming in, and there'd be cars circling the block. I was like, can we now turn this into erect a little pavilion and turn this into like a lunch? Every Saturday, everybody who shows up, sit down and let's eat and talk and get to know your neighbors. That would be my sort of hope. And it would be uncomfortable and it would be awkward, and there'd be people who didn't speak the same language. And you might, in Washington, D.C. area, you might have 2 people of opposite parties who ran against one another sitting at the same table.
So as I said at the beginning of our conversation, a big focus we have here at Benedictine College is to form the students in particular in community of faith and scholarship. What advice would you give to college students who want to help, who want to be part of the solution?
So again, there's nothing that's going to replace giving your time to people in need and search for ways to help them belong, which involves you joining stuff. And if the thing to join doesn't exist, start a thing. Don't try to do things by yourself, but just say, let's get a bunch of people together and we'll look to help the people who need help. And you'll find that joining a real strong institution of civil society is one where people come together and they're pursuing a greater good outside of themselves. So you can think, oh, well, I'm sacrificing my time, I'm doing that. You will get so much more out of trying to come together and serve other people than you expect. And you might get more than the people you're trying to serve. So I would look to plug into institutions that are already there, if need be, form them. And we don't always think in terms of institutions and clubs, but really that's the way you have to think about service.
Mr. Carney, this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for coming to campus. Thank you for being part of the show, and thank you for all your work and everything you do.
Thank you.
And thank you to all of our viewers and listeners. Be sure to share this with your friends and family, and we'll see you next time. God bless. If you enjoyed the Benedictine Dialogues today, I want to invite you to visit our website, media.benedictine.edu. Be sure to subscribe to our weekly newsletter where you will receive all of the latest in your inbox, or subscribe to our YouTube channel as well. Thanks again for watching. God bless.